important distinction that I would like to introduce is between individual corruption and corruption as a social practice, corruption as an aggregate. As I told you from the start, there is no society free of corruption. And even in my experiences as an academic working in development, I have seen how people who come from countries which seem completely free of corruption and who do wonderfully well in corruption charts, when they are moved in environments where actually corruption is rife. Like, for instance, let's say, somebody from Germany operating in Kosovo. They can operate quite corruptly, simply because the kind of constraints which operate in Germany to prevent somebody from being corrupt do not operate in Kosovo, or didn't immediately after the conflict when I observed this kind of behavior. And therefore, it is quite important, also for policy reasons, in order to know how to address this, to separate between individual corruption, which is the same in absolutely all societies, even if legislation varies wildly across societies, and corruption as a social practice. The prevalence of corruption as a social practice vary very importantly from developed to developing countries. There are quite a lot of theories, actually, which try to explain what is the role, what is the interplay between corruption and development, if actually by becoming more developed you become less corrupt, or in fact corruption is the major factor which prevents your development. And I think that the latest school of thought is roughly the latter. Today we believe that completely corrupt societies where the prevalence of corruption is very high, do not develop. And it is quite important to understand this and do not to address corruption as simply individual deviation from an otherwise rule of, or norm, if you want, of public integrity in a society. In a developing society, you are going to have very likely a very high prevalence of corrupt phenomena. And in other words, you have to think how to build normalcy, how to build the opposite of corruption, how to build public integrity, rather than how to just suppress this deviant behavior, because you wouldn't know what is deviation and what is norm. Most people will behave corruptly. If you arrest a corrupt official, the official who replaces them probably will behave corruptly as well, because definitely when corruption becomes a system, this is what happens. And this is what I call in my work basically institutional corruption, which is systematic abuse of authority to divert public resources which are meant for universal use on the basis of equality, more or less, to the benefit of particular private interests. And if this is systematic and has a very high prevalence, you can call this systematic corruption. Now, there is another definition of institutional corruption which comes from Harvard Law School and which refers mostly to United States of America. And this is why it's important to discuss them in parallel, because sometimes definitions from the developed world are not good for the developing world. Now, what, for instance, Dennis Thompson and his followers call institutional corruption is simply the systematic misinterpretation of the Constitution in the United States, which is to the detriment of democracy and reduces voice for most groups of the population and caters it more and more towards specific interest groups. Now, I think this is a very restrictive definition and simply would just refer to either United States, or I think the second weak spot of this definition is that if people who are believers in this American institutional corruption and who believe that the Constitution demands more equal treatment than the Americans get, they can prove a lot that there is, for instance, uneven access to government of citizens. For instance, very rich companies which pay lobby group get to spend more time with American congressmen than ordinary voters. This is proven, they have evidence for that. What they do not have evidence of, and this is why I think that they should not call this institutional corruption, as we call institutional corruption simply the prevalence of corrupt behavior in a society. What they do not prove is reciprocity from the part of congressmen. They do not prove that these congressmen simply give more favors to these lobby groups or who are behind them than to ordinary citizens. This doesn't tend to happen very much in the United States of America simply because democracy functions and even ordinary citizens have a way of paying back to corrupt politicians by not voting them into office.